I'm a Christian. I served my church first as a priest and then as a bishop for almost 50 years. I am not a biblical literalist, though I was one for many years, and my mother died a strict biblical fundamentalist. I'm still very thankful that I had that upbringing, though I have abandoned that point of view. But that evangelical upbringing gave me an insatiable desire to study the Scriptures. And that study has dominated my life for my entire career. Not a day goes by that I do not wrestle with the words of the Bible. The resurrection narratives have been a primary focus of that study for me. The last book I wrote on the resurrection, not the one that Dr. Craig quoted, was revelatory in its title. I submitted that manuscript to my publisher, HarperCollins, with the working title, Resurrection, Myth and Reality. HarperCollins changed my title and published it under the title, Resurrection, Myth or Reality. I think it has to be both. They wanted to suggest that I believed that it could be one or the other. Harper has invested a lot of money in making me controversial, and they wanted to make sure that they didn't lose on their investment. But let me go over those two things. The reality. Yes, the resurrection's real. And Dr. Craig pointed to some of the things that I still hold quite firmly. The resurrection was an event of such power and such life-changing energy that the disciples who had all abandoned Jesus at the time of his arrest and had forsaken him and fled were reconstituted. And not just reconstituted, but quite willing to give their lives for the reality of that experience. There's enormous power in that. Secondly, we must not forget that these are Jewish men. And in the Jewish tradition, the most sacred part of the whole tradition was that God was one. Nothing could stand in the presence of God. And yet there was something about whatever the resurrection was that was so powerful and so overwhelming that these Jewish men had to expand their definition of God so that it was big enough to include Jesus of Nazareth. And they were no longer able to look at Jesus of Nazareth without seeing him as part of who God is. And thirdly, they created a new holy day. Now, for those of us who have been in active ministry with congregations, we know how serious and important that is. When I was the Bishop of Newark, I had churches that I was quite sure that if the Lord God, God's self, had appeared before those congregations and said, folks, I want you to change the Sunday hour from 10 to 10:30 beginning next week, some in those congregations would say, but Lord, that's not the way we do it in this church. Changing people's worship traditions is a powerful, powerful argument. But something happened that was associated with the first day of the week that created, certainly within one generation, a new holy day that stood side by side with Jewish Sabbath. And then when the Christian faith finally moved out of its Jewish orbit and into the Mediterranean Gentile world, the Jewish Sabbath was dropped, and the Christian Sunday became the holy day of the Western world. It's still interesting to me that we put Jewish Sabbath and Christian Sunday together to create the weekend, which we still observe whether we are religious or not. So there is reality to the resurrection experience that I would not want anybody to think that I would doubt or question. But a God experience has to be put into human words. And that's where mythology enters. And by mythology, I mean that human beings do not speak a God language. We only speak a human language. So whenever we have a God experience, we have to put that experience into our human created frame of reference. And our language is simply not big enough to capture the wonder, the mystery, the reality of that inbreaking eternity. And so what do? We have to develop expansive language. We have to get it beyond our abilities. And that's what I see over and over again in the biblical narratives. I take those narratives seriously. I do not take them literally. But we need to face the fact that the inadequacy of all human language is something we must deal with. The only way a 21st century person can be a Christian is to be able to put the experience of God into 21st century language. Let me illustrate that for just a moment. If you witnessed an epileptic seizure in the first century, and if you witnessed an epileptic seizure in the 21st century, the reality that you would experience would be identical. But if you were to read the explanation that first century people gave to that epileptic seizure, and the explanation that 21st century people gave to that epileptic seizure, you would recognize that language is time-bound and time-warped. And if you ever take the language of a human explanation and say that this is the ultimate literal truth, it seems to me you have violated the eternity of that experience. Let me look at the language of the resurrection narratives for just a bit. And to tell you, if you're going to literalize the stories, this fanciful language gets in the way of a lot of modern people. Matthew says there was an earthquake when Jesus died, and another earthquake when the resurrection occurred. Were those literal earthquakes, or was he speaking poetically? The Gospels say that at 12 noon on the first Good Friday, darkness covered the whole earth until 3 o'clock. Was that a literal darkness, perhaps an eclipse of the sun? Or was that a poetic reference to what it meant to watch this love of God die? The Gospels say that when Jesus died, the veil in the temple was split from top to bottom. You need to understand what that veil meant. It separated the holy place where people could gather from the Holy of Holies, which was thought to be God's dwelling place. And the only person that could go into the Holy of Holies was the high priest. And he could go only once a year and after enormous purification rites. That veil separated human life from the ultimate presence of God. Was that a literal splitting? Was that a poetic way they were trying to describe what the meaning of the death of Jesus was? Matthew says in a gospel I heard read this morning at St. James Cathedral here in South Bend, that when the death of Jesus occurred, the earthquake opened up the graves. And people who had been long dead came up out of their graves and walked around in Jerusalem and were seen by people. Is that literal? Or is that poetic language? And then we're told that angels can ride on the wings of the wind to announce the resurrection, that they have the power to strike guards and put them in a state of unconscious stupor, and that they can roll back the stone, and that they can talk to the women, I presume in Aramaic, since that was the only language the women spoke. Can these descriptions of the resurrection that include all of these poetic symbols, could they still be real? Is there something behind that language that cannot be denied? And is the story of a dead man walking out of a tomb, presumably 3 days after his death, physically resuscitated? Is that literal language? Or is that language of people who are so transformed by the power of the living God that they have to create human language to communicate that experience? The second thing I think we need to look at when we look at those narratives is that they disagree on almost every detail. Let me walk you through them. Who went to the tomb at dawn on the first day of the week? We have 4 Gospels. We have 4 different lists. The only consistent figure in all 4 of them is Mary Magdalene. Did the women see the risen Lord in the garden at dawn on the first day of the week? No, says Mark. Yes, says Matthew. No, says Luke. Yes, says John. Even my friend Jerry Falwell can't make those fit together. It just won't work. It's a contradiction. Where were the disciples when they had this life-changing, in-breaking experience of resurrected power? Where were they? The Gospels don't even agree with that. Mark says it will be in Galilee. Matthew says it was in Galilee. Luke says it was never in Galilee. It was always in Jerusalem in the immediate environs. And John says it was in Jerusalem first. But then when he writes an appendix to his gospel in chapter 21, he makes a Galilean appearance much, much later. Indeed, it's hard to date the time, perhaps even years. Was the risen Christ physical? Well, Paul says he appeared. He never describes that appearance, so you don't get any data as to whether it was physical or not. Mark never describes the risen Christ appearing to anyone. Oh, there's a later addition to Mark that does, but in the authentic part of Mark's gospel, there is no appearance of the risen Christ to anyone. That's our earliest gospel. Matthew, who sort of seems to say it was a physical Jesus, that the women grabbed the feet of him in the garden on the morning of the resurrection. But then when he tells the story of Jesus appearing to the disciples, it's distinctly not physical. Jesus seems to come out of the heavens, clothed with the authority of the Son of Man. And he comes to give the disciples only their marching orders. Go into all the world and proclaim the gospel. It's only when you get to Luke and John, the last two gospels, I would date them in the late 9th decade and the mid-10th decade. It's only in these latter gospels that you begin to get appearances and empty tombs and all of the physical part of that resurrection story. But even here, Luke describes this Christ as having the ability to materialize on the road to Emmaus and to dematerialize after the breaking of the bread. That doesn't sound like any physicality that I understand. And John has the Christ have the ability to walk into a locked and barred upper room and still offer his physical wounds to Thomas to print, to feel, to touch, physicality. Were they trying to determine that the experience that they were having after the death of Jesus was in fact an experience of a living Christ who was identical with that Jesus? And that's the language that they used to describe it. There's no doubt in my mind that any of us would be here today talking about the resurrection if there weren't something real about it. But I think we've got to begin to open the scriptures to scholarship, open them to a new understanding, so that we don't have to take 21st century minds and twist them into first century pretzels in order to be disciples of Jesus of Nazareth. I'm a member of the Jesus Seminar. We have 250 PhD Bible scholars, Catholic and Protestant, and they would not agree at all with either the timing that Dr. Craig mentioned or with some of his historicity of such things as the tomb, the empty tomb. When you read biblical material, you're not always reading primary sources. We know for a fact that Matthew copied Mark into his gospel. Matthew copies about 90% of Mark into his gospel. We know that Luke also had Mark in front of him when he wrote, so Luke copies about half of Mark into his gospel. So when Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree, it's no mystery. They have the same source. Mark is the primary source for all of them. Let me suggest that our dating system would be quite different. Paul, in my dating scheme, would write between 50 and 64. I assume that you would agree probably with that. But when we get past that, I would date Mark after 70. I would date Matthew in the mid-80s. I would date Luke the late 80s, maybe even the early 90s. And I've never seen anybody that suggested that Acts was as early as Dr. Craig has suggested. Indeed, if you read people like Burton Mack, you'll find that he dates Acts way in the 2nd century. There's a great deal of debate about that. But it's interesting to me that the people who want to make sure that literal biblical content is believed always opt for the earlier and earlier dating processes, which I don't believe can be substantiated. The fact is that the Gospels are written sometime between 40 and 70 years after the earthly life of Jesus came to an end, and it was written in a language that Jesus didn't speak. So before you and I read our Bibles, the story of Jesus is lived in oral transmission for 40 to 70 years and has gone through one translation. All I want us to do is to keep open our minds to the possibility that the story might have grown in that transmission. Not the essential experience, but the way it is described. Please recognize there is a difference between an experience which is real and eternal and the way anybody explains that experience at any given moment in time. The explanation always warps it in time, always binds it in time. Let me also suggest that the idea that the Gospels are biography is an idea that I know of no one in the New Testament world that I associate with would agree. I think of the Gospels, at least the synoptics, I can't make a case for John, but the synoptics, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, I would say that the underlying principle creating those is liturgy, not biography, liturgy. He even suggested that everybody agrees that the crucifixion took place during the time of the Passover. I'm not sure everybody agrees with that at all. One of the earliest ways in which the Christ was interpreted was by Paul, who said, Christ is our new Passover. And you need to understand the Jewish Passover to understand what that claim was. It was an astonishing claim. In the Passover story, the angel of death passed over Jewish homes where the blood of the paschal lamb had been placed on the doorpost. So the blood of the paschal lamb was thought to have the power to dispel death. Paul says, Jesus is our new Passover. I think what lies behind that is that people were trying to process the Jesus experience. He died on the cross. They needed to make sense out of that. And so they likened it to the death of the paschal lamb. The cross became the doorpost of the world. The blood of the paschal lamb was shed on the cross. That blood has the power to overcome death. Those of us who come to God through that paschal lamb's self-offering can find eternal life. That's a powerful sermon that Paul was preaching. And I think that's probably what led them to see or to begin to place the crucifixion at the time of the Passover. A scholar at Birmingham University, where Dr. Craig got his doctorate, is named Michael Goulder, Michael Donald Goulder. Fascinating man, because he became an atheist late in his life, but he was a profound New Testament scholar. But Michael Goulder suggested that the primary thing that organizes the New Testament is the liturgical life of the synagogue, because the stories of Jesus were remembered and recalled in the synagogue. That's where they lived. The Christian movement didn't break away from the synagogue officially until 88 of this Common Era. So the Jesus narrative was lived in the synagogue. And as it was lived in the synagogue, it was constantly interpreted against synagogue worship. Have you ever wondered why Mark is the shortest gospel of the three? I think it's because Mark gives you Jesus stories that go from Rosh Hashanah, Jewish New Year, to Passover, the first celebration of the Jewish year in the month of Nisan. And John the Baptist, who opens Mark's gospel, is very much a Rosh Hashanah figure. What happened at Rosh Hashanah? They blew the trumpet. They gathered the people. They said, prepare for the kingdom of God to come, which is the essential John the Baptist message. And then you drive that gospel all the way through. The Jews had a day called the Festival of Dedication. It came in the month of Kislev, our month of December. We tend to call it Hanukkah. But in the Festival of Dedication, they celebrated the light of God being restored to the temple, the true worship of God being restored. It comes out of the Maccabean period of Jewish history. It's interesting to me that exactly at that point in Mark's gospel, he tells the story of the transfiguration of Jesus, the light of God coming down upon Jesus, who is the new temple, the new meeting place between God and human life. And the idea that Jesus is the new temple gets picked up in the later Gospels when Jesus is quoted as saying, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will build it up." And they didn't understand, says the Gospel writer, because he was referring to the temple of his own body. The only way that I believe that they could have seen Jesus as the new temple was that they lived in a world where the temple had been destroyed, which happened in the year 70 AD in the Great Roman War. So I see Jesus being interpreted liturgically against the background of the Jewish worship cycle, and that's the organizing principle. The reason Matthew and Luke had to expand Mark was that they wanted to have Christian readings for all of the Sabbaths of the year. And Mark only provided about 6.5 months. So Matthew and Luke both stretched Mark. Matthew stretched it in a very Jewish direction. Luke stretched it in a much more Gentile direction. I think if we can begin to develop liturgical eyes, to begin to read our narratives, we will begin to see so much more. One of the reasons that I don't think we've been able as Christians to look at the Bible as that which look at the Gospels as that which grew out of the synagogue worship tradition is that we have been frankly anti-Semitic throughout our history. When I was a Sunday school boy, going to my evangelical Sunday school in Charlotte, North Carolina, I never met a good Jew in my Sunday school material. They were all evil people. They were sinister. They were out to get Jesus, or they were out to get Paul. Nobody ever told me that Jesus was a Jew. That sort of escaped notice. Oh, I knew that Judas Iscariot was a Jew. I knew that the Pharisees and the Sadducees were Jews, and the chief priests were Jews. The scribes, they were Jews. But nobody ever told me that Jesus was a Jew, and that Paul was a Jew, and that Mary and Joseph were Jews, and Mary Magdalene was a Jew, and all of the disciples were Jews, because they were good people. It was given to me as good Christians against bad Jews. Well, I think we've got to begin to open our eyes and to recognize that this Jewish Jesus was interpreted first within a Jewish frame of reference. And then when we left that frame of reference, we lost a lot of our understanding. One final note before I finish. You've heard many a time, I'm sure, Jesus died for my sins. It's a mantra among Christians. You ever wonder where it comes from? The Jews had a day called Yom Kippur, where they killed a lamb who was perfect mentally, morally, and physically. And then they took the blood of this lamb who stood between them and God, because they weren't aware, they weren't capable of standing in that place close to God, and they sprinkled the blood of this lamb on the people so that they were washed in the blood of the lamb, cleansed from their sins, and restored to God. That was a Jewish worship tradition, and it has deep echoes in the Christian tradition, and I think we miss them because we cannot read the Bible with Jewish eyes.
Thank you very much.